So in chapter 2, the mating market, David Buss starts getting into some of the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about in terms of sexual conflict and how that's related to a biological understanding or a psychological understanding of violence. And so he starts off with a term called strategic interference. And so when a strategy pursued by one sex interferes with the successful implementation of a strategy pursued by the other, it produces sort of like this incongruence. And that's where you get that defensive tactic or a counterbalancing tactic done by the other sex. And it can lead to this Red Queen type scenario where there's this conflict, and there's a back and forth between tactics of men and women, particularly on the dating or the sexual market. And so one of the incongruences that we see is the desire for sexual variety. And again, I'll say it's on average. Not all men are the same, not all women are the same, and there's differences among them, and there's variations. But on average, what we see is that men are more likely than females to want sex with more than one partner over a certain set of time. And those sex differences tend to prove to be culturally universal. And they find in their research that this is really without a single exception, that biological sex trumped even sexual orientation in the desire for sexual activity. So men wanted more sexual partners over shorter periods of time than did females. And all studies show a sex difference in infidelity rates, and that men are more likely than women to be faithful in their relationships, even if it is through marriage. And as he says here, among women, 70% cite love or emotional connection as the key reason for having an affair, where if you look at why men have affair, is generally related to sexual attraction. So we have an incongruence here, and this can lead to sexual conflict. Often, we also see that most women need a bit more time, information, emotional involvement before consenting to sex with a stranger or someone who they've just recently met. And men and women differ profoundly in their desire for sexual variety. So again, there's a length of time difference and the frequency or the number of sex partners that is desired between men and women. Again, this is what can lead to violence within society, not only between men and women, but among men and women as well. So men having conflicts with other men and females having conflicts with other females. And interestingly, when we look at the sexual marketplace, men are more likely than women to err in overestimating their desirability on the market. So men often think that they are more attractive, that they are a better mate than really other women are seeing them as. Women tend to be attracted primarily to men in the top 20th percentile, as I said in the other lecture, where men are willing to to date down when it comes to sex. Again, think about this. It costs men less to have more sexual partners. If they have children with multiple women, even if they are quote unquote less desirable, it doesn't cost them anything. They're not carrying those children. And oftentimes they don't care for the children once they're born. So especially when we look again in our history, it's advantageous for men to have more sexual partners and it's less costly for them. Where for females, they have to carry that child for 10 months. And so this is very costly, and they're going to be choosier than men are when it comes to a sexual mate. I love this quote: men are one long breeding experiment run by women. Again, women are the resource. Men, it doesn't take many of us, again, to have children, but it does take more women because of that investment of carrying the child to term and then caring for that infant once the infant is born. Interesting, again, remember, our evolutionary history and biology is interfering and is driven by cultural advancements like internet dating. And what we see is for men, this offers more opportunities for men to deceive women about their mating qualifications. And this is really unprecedented when we look at our evolutionary history. Again, we also know that this also provides women with other opportunities to attract men and use their own deception on the internet dating market. What we see when we look at men is they post deceptive cues to their worth. And this can be Rolex watches, so expensive jewelry, expensive houses with swimming pools, poses next to fancy cars. Whether or not they actually own those things, they can portray to other women that, hey, look, I am a good catch. I make a lot of money. I have a good job. I'm gonna have a steady employment. And look, I can buy cars, houses, fancy jewelry as a signal as their worth. And this leads to other sort of cultural things like ghosting, the sudden ceasing of communication with someone that they have, previously had expressed romantic interest, and also other opportunities for self-deception in order to carry out deception broadly more successfully. So deceivers who truly believe their own lies make it more difficult to detect those liars, right? If you believe your own lies and you portray that to other people, they're more likely to believe you. So this idea of self-deception is also problematic, and we see it increasing in our culture nowadays. So while men kind of lie about their jobs and how much they make and the resources that they have, when we look on the flip side, women are more likely to lie about sexual qualities, their weight, particularly men are more likely to lie about their height, but both sexes tend to post pictures that are less than 100% accurate. And again, this is something new in our culture, internet dating, social media. But if we trace it backwards, there are definitely evolutionary reasons why we deceive in those types of ways. Again, if we look at the research, men dramatically underestimate how upsetting unwanted sexual advances are, such as leering and touching are to women. So they just say, oh, this is flirting. This is no big deal. And women overestimate how upset men would be if they were sexually harassed by women. So again, men really seeing those types of things, touching and leering and flirting, as less severe as women. Again, leading to not really understanding some of these cues in the context within people are on when people are on the dating market. So there are resources and acquisition strategies that are exploitive, like deception, coercion, threats, intimidation, terrorization, or outright force. And we do see that men use these tactics more so than women do. And there's research that shows things that when it comes to victimization, there are individuals that tend to be more likely to be victimized and have greater exposure and vulnerability in certain situations. And as David Buss says in the book, and as I wanted to repeat, this does not mean that victims, whether they be male or female, deserve to be victimized. That's absolutely not the case. No one deserves to be victimized. Similarly, people are not responsible for their victimization, right? The responsibility for victimization is solely on that of the perpetrator. What we are looking at when we look at an evolutionary perspective are what are those factors and those characteristics that increase exposure and vulnerability. If we know those things, we're more likely to be able to do things and keep people, communities, and cultures safer. So again, this is not victim blaming. The sole responsibility is on the perpetrator. And no one deserves morally to be victimized. So keeping that in mind, we're looking at the factors and characteristics that empirical research shows increases the chances of exposure, of vulnerability, and using that knowledge to make our culture safer and increasing well-being for everybody. So when we look at the psychology of sexual exploitability, there are things like low self-esteem in women, gullibility that increases experiencing sexual coercion, low cognitive ability, so reflecting poor mind reading skills, difficulty in processing complex information, and perhaps an inability to discern those exploitative intentions of others, again, increases the likelihood that they will become victims of this type of activity. As well, again, making sure that we're not victim blaming here, but flirtatiousness, promiscuity, permissive sexual attitudes, all of these things do put individuals at greater risk of experiencing victimization, as does recklessness or risk taking. And that's for both men and women. But really, when we're looking at who tends to be victims in these scenarios, it tends on average and to a greater likelihood be females. And we see this. Men found women perceived as cognitively disadvantaged to be easier to seduce, deceive, and pressure into having sex. Men who perceived women to be immature and young, to be more sexually exploitable than women who were somewhat older and more emotionally mature. Certainly, we know intoxication, being quote unquote sleepy, were cues to perpetrators of sexual exploitability. And so if we look at this, the evidence suggests that women who wear provocative clothing, that activates the amygdala. There's actually a physiological and neurological reaction in men when they see provocative clothing that activates the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex. Often you'll see that abbreviated as ACC. And these are brain regions involved in arousal and desire. Going back to the dark triad, people who are high scores on agreeableness, who, they're nice, they're cooperative, they're empathetic. They, sometimes call us the light triad characteristics of people. They're less likely to take advantage of others, to exploit them, where people high in the dark triad are more likely to go out and try to exploit other people. So there are individual characteristics that increase perpetration of sexual violence. Those females that are physically attractive women that score high in openness to experience were especially likely to signal exploitability. So unfortunately, I mean, this is one of those things where flirtatiousness, openness, agreeableness, all of those things may signal to a man that has those high dark triad qualities that this individual is more exploitable than someone else. So the paradox here is that men scoring high in those dark triad traits, so like narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, they actually tend to be attractive to women. So women are, the research shows, attracted to those that do portray some of those characteristics. They are socially charming. They exude self-confidence and status. They tend to be smooth and have coordinated body language. So all of these things that are related to the dark triad tend to be socially desirable for women. And so it's this quote unquote bad boy paradox. And one of the theories behind this is what they call the quote unquote sexy son genes, right? A hypothesis that was put forth by R.A. Fisher in the 1930s. So again, way before the dark triad, that if women were to bear sons who are high scoring and psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism, those traits would then in turn make them more desirable to women, and women can increase their reproductive success when their sons in turn have sons and daughters. So they are grandparents of many grandchildren. So if they're able to do that, then they have successfully transferred their genes throughout the generations. So men are more likely to have narcissism and to have psychopathy, but women are about on par with men in terms of Machiavellianism, tactics like whatever it takes, you must get important people on your side. It's wise to keep track of information that you can use against other people later. It's wise not to tell your secrets. Make sure your plan benefits you, not others. Men and women tend to be pretty similar on agreeing with those values. And so this is to maintain access to partners who provide either one with clothes, money, and those types of characteristics. So again, we have culture, we have biology, intertwining, and really playing back and forth with one another in terms of how men and women differ from each other, but how their sexual tactics increase the likelihood that they will successfully transfer their genes throughout generations, but how conflict can then arise out of incongruence between men and women, and how men can also be exploited by other men, and we have intersex conflict as well. And again, this will play out as we continue to read Why Men Behave Badly by David Buss.